As we think about Islamic theology, we're going to be doing about 20 lectures in this course. That's beside your reading. The lectures will coincide with the stuff you're reading, but it will also supplement it, primarily in the sense of Christian mission, because 3/4 of the way through the lectures, we're going to be talking about how all of this relates to Christian witness. These stuff is not in the texts, but we will have a quiz bank, and we will be quizzing on the reading, but we will also have forums/group projects, and these are always interesting because they're asking questions that we need to think about and we need to participate in, and we learn from one another on these. In this first lecture, we'll be talking about an introduction, of course, this one and the next one. But in this one particularly, we'll be thinking about the challenge of Islam and the unity within Islam and the diversity within Islam. First of all, the challenge of Islam. One of the main things that we're concerned about, at least Christians are concerned about, and non-Christians as well, is the growth and the way that Muslims are spreading. We do know that Islam has a majority in about 50 countries, which is pretty impressive. Places in North Africa primarily and the Middle East have an overwhelming majority of Muslims, not just 90 to 100%, but also 75 to 89% in some cases, like Indonesia or Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan, and Niger. But then we get down to those countries who have less of a majority, such as Nigeria, which is about half Muslim, half Christian. Christianity has grown dramatically there in that country. And but let's take particular notice of places where Islam is in the minority, like Tanzania, Ethiopia, Cameroon, Ivory Coast, Kazakhstan, or Turkmenistan. Even more significant is the places where from 5% to 24.9% you have all kinds of countries where Islam is in the minority. And even less than that. In other words, quite a few countries in Europe now have considerably less than 5%. Many countries of the world. And it seems to me that Muslims have learned how to live as minorities, but the problem is have they learned how to treat minorities when they do have a majority? For example, right now, as we speak, a Christian woman in Pakistan has been accused of blasphemy. Just a village woman, probably illiterate, doesn't make any difference, but they don't have a reputation of treating minorities very well at all. And we'll look at this later. But there are many minorities among Muslims, such as the Ahmadis. So that's significant. I think 300 million Muslims, though, live as minorities, and that's pretty significant. Let's think of the diversity among Muslims. Diversity in a sense that they're not all the same. Someone has said, Frederick Denny wrote in his book, that to look at Islam is like looking at a triangle. And 3 parts of the triangle include a religious way, number 1, or number 2, history, or number 3, culture. And he says in certain Muslim contexts, the religious way is by far the largest part of the triangle. In other words, that's the long part. So in such a situation as that, Islam would be dominant and very overpowering. But certainly culture is part of Islam, isn't it? Always part of Islam, but not always as large a part as others. Now, holism is another issue we talk about. We could say totalitarianism. and in particular Maududi in Pakistan, who is the architect of South Asian Islam, was very, very outspoken and influential in this regard. But not just him. The Ayatollah Khomeini used to say over and over again, politics is religion. And back to Maududi, who wrote 120 books on Islam, most of them sound very, very political. In fact, only one of those 120 books is theological. He tried to make the whole of Islam supreme over the whole of life. And in particular, he tried in Pakistan to bring every facet of Pakistani society in line with Islamic theology. He failed miserably. There's no unity and no justice, and certainly not a very successful brand of Islam. Going on to the next one, Islam is urban. Islam is in the city. And you can look at major cities of the world, including Los Angeles, New York, or Paris and London, and see how many hundreds of thousands of Muslims live in those cities. Someone told me just the other day he estimated there to be 800,000 Turks in New York City. They feel comfortable in the city. Renaissance and radicalization. In 1979, there seemed to be a watershed of Renaissance, a revival. It wasn't the first one that they've had, because you can look back in the history of Islam, they've had lots of revivals. But as far as the modern age is concerned, 1979 seemed to be pivotal. That was the year of the Iranian hostages. The American hostages were taken over in Iran, and that was the year that Khomeini came back to Iran. So there are a lot of things that happened that year. And Muslims, in many ways, think that they're on a roll. And they certainly don't just want to be pious, but they want to be, they're ambitious. They have an ambitious global force. I'm not saying that they're all united in what they want to accomplish, but some of them are. They want to change culture, social society, and they want to bring justice to the world. Question is, how do we respond? Not just to the revival or the Renaissance in Islam, but to radical Muslims. In some ways, it seems like Christians are no different. And evangelical Christians have become militant themselves, some of the things they say. Where are they getting this from? They're certainly not getting it from the Bible in some of their response, because I don't think that evangelical Christians, by and large, are thinking biblically and missionally about Muslims. Let's think about the adaptability and the incompatibility of Muslims. On the one hand, they seem to adapt. And if you go to places in Europe, for instance, the England, Muslims have adapted very well. They've brought things into England, and they've taken on their own personality. For example, a political party, which is a religious political party of the Jamaat Islam, Party of Islam, born in India, transported to Pakistan. It has now, you can now find it in the UK, you can find it in Bangladesh. It seems to have been, it seems to be adapting itself. Other groups have too, like Young Muslims of UK. They're flexible, and they're just sort of adapting to the circumstance. But on the other hand, there seems to be, excuse me, an incompatibility of Muslims in some cases. For example, just a few weeks ago, Mrs. Merkel said in Germany, she said that multiculturalism has failed. What she meant by that was that 4 million Turks have not adapted. They're not fitting in. And it's just not it's not just Germany, it's France and other places too, that the Muslims seem to be at odds and by themselves, not integrating very well at all. Honor and shame. Muslims sometimes shame one another into being better Muslims. I think of Ahmed Didat, who was very good. He's now dead, but he was very good at shaming Muslims into being more aggressive. And in some ways he was an embarrassment to Muslims, but in other ways he worked on the honor-shame principle. So these are some of the issues. Now let's think about unity within Islam. What Muslims say is that they say we are united, you are divided. And they say that these are some of the reasons for this. They say that we as Muslims, we worship one God. You have three, Father, Son, and Spirit. We are one people. You are many denominations. They say we are one book. You have many Bibles. They say that the reason for the oneness is, first of all, Allah himself. And we will be talking a lot about Allah in Islam in this course. After all, it is theology. But Muslims are radically monotheist. And so were the Jews, for that matter, after the diaspora. And so Jesus dealt with these kind of people. And I think that's one of the reasons why he was so careful in his statements about who he was. But he tried to show it in different ways. But he was very cautious in saying, I am the Son of God. I am God. He tried to prove it in different ways. Another unifying factor in Islam is Muhammad. In one way, Muhammad is the only thing that Muslims really agree on. They are very divided on almost everything. But on one thing they seem to agree, that Muhammad is the great one. Muhammad Iqbal, the great philosopher of the East, said that love for the Prophet, that's the Arabian Prophet, runs like blood in the vein of the community, of the Muslim community. So you can see evidence of this, like the blasphemy laws in Pakistan and the Danish cartoons or various issues like that, how fond Muslims are of Muhammad. Their beliefs too are simple, and they do bring Muslims together. The simple beliefs they have of faith in one God, belief in the prophets, the holy books, the angels, the spirits, the day of judgment, and predestination. They are strong on beliefs, not just strong on works, but strong in their beliefs. Wensink, a book called The Muslim Creeds, says that faith is sufficient for salvation in Islam. I don't quite think it's completely true, but nevertheless, that's what he said. Now, practices. You also have a unity within Islam by the practices, the deen, the creed, the prayers, the alms, the fasting, the pilgrimage, and in some cases the struggle or jihad, which can be military action, can be militant. It certainly has in the past. But Muslims are very, very much together on this, on the simplicity and the unity of these practicing Islam. Now, the community, or the ummah, there is a sense of community in Islam. For example, you can go to the airport in Karachi, this huge city of 18 million people, the international airport, and you might see a Japanese there, a Muslim Japanese, saying his prayers or her prayers. The behavior is, when they say their prayers, is very unified. Even though they're Japanese, nevertheless, there is this unity among them. And they base it, as I've mentioned, on God. He is supreme. I was going to read a couple of verses from the Quran in this respect, from Surah 3, 105, 103 to 105. I won't read all the verses, but just pick out statements as to the unity. It says, "Be not divided among yourselves. Remember with gratitude Allah's favor on you." And then it goes on to say that by His grace you became brethren. And in 104, it says, "A band of people inviting to all that is good, enjoining what is right, forbidding what is wrong. They are the ones to attain felicity." So there are good things in Islam, and we have to remember that. There are good things that Muslims do. Do we recognize those? Now, law, Sharia, is another unifying force. Remember that Islam is basically law. It's law more than anything else. Not often what we think of law as law, because it's moral injunctions and one thing another. That's really makes it up so much, the duties of what you're supposed to do and what you're not supposed to do. And so they're not as unified as they sometimes think they are. But nevertheless, law is something that is very important. Now, history is also very important to Muslims. It's a unifying factor. When I was doing my dissertation, the dissertation was Islamic ideology and fundamentalism in Pakistan, climate for conversion to Christianity, ? It was I think a valuable work. It was chosen as one of the top books on missions in the United States in 1998. I talked about the catalysts of fundamentalism, if that's the word that we can use. It's not in other words, no word you use is perfect. But that's the word I used. And I said that there are various catalysts that are propelling Muslims to fundamentalism. One of them is the trauma that they're experiencing. In other words, the crises. Another one is Israel. Another one is the West. And I named several catalysts. But one of them was history. And I said that Muslims have a tendency to look over their shoulders, look back again, and what do they see? They see great things in history. Muslims did great things. God was with us. For example, in the Battle of Badr, which was like the Battle of Jericho for Muslims, when Muhammad, with a few Muslims, won over non-Muslims, the Meccans, in 624, he said God did it. And so when Muslims today look back and see the things that they have done in the past and how God was with them, they wonder why it's not happening today, and they're frustrated. Geography, we can think of unifying factors in the geography of Muslims. One of them is in reference to Mecca. The Kaaba is a unifying factor because 3 of the 5 pillars point to the Kaaba. Muhammad, you might remember, changed the direction of prayer. One time when he was in Medina, after things had fallen through in his attempt to win the Jews over, because before that he looked to Jerusalem when he said his prayers. But, according to traditions, in the middle of his prayer one day, he whirled and he faced Mecca, and from then on Muslims have faced the Kaaba. And they want to do it all the same. They want to do it right. There is a strange unity there in the geography that Muslims think of. And I think in culture as well. Going on to the next one. When you look at various videos of the Muslim world, there is a certain similarity. In other words, often an emphasis on mosques, simplicity of mosques. There's a sameness. There is the emphasis on modesty, the emphasis on respect for the aged, hospitality, what is halal and what is haram. In other words, what is okay and what is forbidden. That is something of unifying. And then there is, I think, a self-identity among Muslims. Oftentimes they say, we are Muslim. They're not ashamed of it. They think in many cases that we're the best. Allah is on our side. And However, that is, I think, eroding, given all the things that Muslims are experiencing, all the things that radical Muslims are doing. I think that that sense of identity is eroding. But in other ways, it's an attempt to identify themselves. For example, the veil, the struggles over the veil is, I think, oftentimes a struggle over self-identity. Even in a place like Syria, where they're forbidding the wearing of the veil, or Turkey, or some of these Muslim countries, not just France. But I think a lot of that has to do with a struggle for self-identity. Who are we? Well, we want to identify ourselves as Muslims. Now, let's talk about the diversity within Islam. Is there a diversity? Yes. This might seem like a contradiction to things we just said, but it is the other side of the coin. There is a lot of nationalism. In other words, disunity between various Muslim countries. Remember that during the Iran-Iraq War, 1980 to 1988, both were Muslims. And when, in other words, both claimed to be fighting a jihad. Both of them said that when you die, you go to heaven. So they're very diverse in their thinking, and oftentimes Muslims don't get along at all, country by country. There's a lot of suspicion. Afghanistan versus Iran, and one thing and another. The only thing they do agree on often is a common enemy. That unites them. For example, that United States is the enemy, or Israel is the enemy. Now, there's lots of things having to do with ethnic diversity. How many ethnicities are there? Well, there could be up to 4,000 of them. One very valuable book is the book called Ethnologue by Barbara and Joseph Grimes, who I think talk about 7,000 languages. Many of them are Muslim languages. But if we could think for a minute about Pakistan and the ethnic diversity there, it's unbelievable. In a place like Karachi, immigrants, those from India, they're called Muhajirs. They're at odds with the Pathans. The Baluch are the underdogs. And everybody hates the Punjabis. The Sindhis are also there. They feel very resentful of the Punjabis as well, who dominate the whole country. And then you have the Saraikis, the area that we were working in, living in south central Pakistan. 20, 30 million people speak Saraiki, but they also feel a great ethnic identity. You have sectarianism in Islam. The Sunnis, of course, dominate the Muslim world with 85% of the people, and often 10 or 15% are Shiite. But they are very resentful of one another. A lot of the bombings that have taken place in Pakistan and Iraq, wherever you go, Sunni against Shia, and then sometimes the Shia reacting. But they differ in other ways too. They differ over ijtihad, which is, a real bone of contention. Muslims, the Sunnis say that there are 4 sources of Islamic law. One is the Quran, naturally. Then there's the Sunnah of the Prophet. There's Qiyas, which is the analogy. In other words, we look back to things that have happened in the past and you try to draw an analogy from something. And then there is Ijma, which is consensus. Well, Sunnis and Shiite disagree on that issue. Shiites basically reject analogy in favor of reason. Shiites say reason is the only valid thing, and if the imams are included. In Pakistan, the Taliban, who are extremists, they have been very hard on the Ahmadiyas. 4 million Ahmadiyas in Pakistan have suffered more than the Christians. In 1995, when I was there doing research for my dissertation, they told me that 100 Ahmadis were in prison on charges of blasphemy. So you see the sectarianism. Then there are theological differences. We can think of several theological differences, but Muslims don't just differ on the Shia-Sunni thing, but they differ in many other ways as well. You can think of radical Muslims, traditional Muslims, fundamentalist Muslims, modernist Muslims, secularist Muslims. There's so many different kinds, not just one kind of Muslim. And I think we could start, if we were to put this on a continuum, you could, with those 5 different kinds of Muslims, you could show how different they are. Radicals, we don't know how many there are in the Muslim world, but there are quite a few of them. Traditionalists basically want to go back to the way things were in the early years of Islam. They don't think about law making so much as law finding. They're always looking back, looking back, looking back. The fundamentalists are just exactly what the term means, be it ever so negative a term for us. I don't think it is for Muslims, but they basically want Islam to control everything, and this is really what they emphasize. The modernists are there. They are out there. They feel that as Muslims we must adopt to the Western ways and to their education. There are modernists, guys like Tariq Ramadan, or a fellow by the name of Fadl who teaches in Southern California, but then quite a few women too are modernist in their thinking, like Irshad Mani and people like that. Then you have secularist Muslims who are basically Muslim in name only, but one we often must think about are the mystics. They are not just folk Muslims. We'll talk more about that next time. But they are people like who think a whole lot of the Rumi, whose tomb is in Turkey. So with this first lecture, then we've had a look at some of the basic issues, and next time we'll go on to lecture number 2 and think of more variety among Muslims.